Story number 1.
It was just a rumor at first. That's how it always begins in small towns, doesn't it? Someone hears something, whispers it to someone else, and suddenly it becomes the truth, even when it isn't. But as the years passed, the stories surrounding the isolated farmhouse at the edge of town became harder to dismiss. People said it had once been home to a group, no, a cult of devotees who worshipped something otherworldly, something that wasn't human. I never believed it. Not at first, anyway. I grew up in Hollow Creek, and like every kid who had heard the stories, I'd always been more curious than afraid. My friends and I would ride our bikes to the old house on the hill, daring each other to step onto the porch or peek through the windows. But no one ever stayed long. There was something about the place, its dark windows, the way the air felt heavier near it, that unsettled us. Then, one day, I noticed something different. I was walking home from school when I saw a strange figure standing at the front gate of the farmhouse. At first, I thought it was just someone working in the yard, maybe a new tenant. But as I approached, the figure didn't move. It wasn't until I was only a few feet away that I realized the person wasn't real at all. It was a mannequin, dressed in ragged clothes, standing unnaturally still by the fence. My heart raced as I took a few cautious steps closer, instinctively reaching for my phone to snap a photo. But just as I did, the figure moved. The head jerked to the side, and I swore I saw its hollow eyes staring right at me. I turned on my heel and ran. I didn't stop until I was back in the safety of my room, trying to convince myself that it had all been a trick of the light, or maybe just my imagination. But deep down, I knew something was off. I tried to push the incident out of my mind, but it lingered. I began noticing more oddities around the farmhouse. Late at night, when I couldn't sleep, I would see flickering lights through the trees, like candles burning in the dark windows. And on rare occasions, I would hear faint chanting carried on the wind. At first, I thought it was just the wind or some distant echo of the town's nightlife. But it started to feel intentional, like someone or something was trying to draw me in. I finally broke down and confided in my friend Grace. She was always the skeptic of our group, the one who laughed off the ghost stories and chalked up everything to superstition. But when I told her about the mannequin and the chanting, she didn't dismiss it like I expected. "You know, my grandmother used to tell me about something like this," she said one evening as we sat in the dimly lit kitchen of her house. "A cult that used to live out near the old farmhouse. They called themselves the Children of the Veil. She said they disappeared years ago, but I don't know. She said they worshipped something dark. And they did things. Terrible things." Her words sent a chill down my spine. I had heard the name before, Children of the Veil, but I had always written it off as part of the folklore that had been passed down, the kind of thing that would be whispered around campfires to spook kids. I never thought it could be real. I tried to ignore it. I really did. But then, one night, things escalated. It was a weekend, and I was spending the night at Grace's place. We decided to go out for a walk and ended up near the farmhouse, drawn by some magnetic pull we couldn't quite explain. It was dark, the moon barely a sliver in the sky, and the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a strange, heavy scent of something I couldn't quite place. We stood at the edge of the property, both too nervous to move closer but too curious to leave. "You hear that?" Grace whispered, her voice trembling. I strained my ears, but I couldn't make anything out over the rustling of the leaves. Then, just as I was about to brush it off, I heard it, a low murmur, almost like a chant. It seemed to come from the house, or maybe the barn that sat behind it, but I couldn't tell for sure. The chanting grew louder, more distinct, and then, to my horror, I saw movement from the corner of my eye. A figure emerged from the shadows at the back of the barn, its silhouette tall and unnaturally thin, draped in a tattered cloak. Before I could process what was happening, another figure appeared beside it, then another and another. Soon there were dozens of them. People, or something pretending to be people, each one draped in similar ragged clothing, their faces obscured by dark hoods. The chant grew louder, more insistent, until it was all I could hear. It felt like the ground beneath me was vibrating, like the earth itself was reacting to the sound. I looked at Grace, her face pale with terror, and I knew we had to leave. But before we could turn and run, one of the figures noticed us. Its head snapped toward us with inhuman speed, its eyes glowing a faint yellow in the darkness. Without thinking, I grabbed Grace's arm and pulled her away, running faster than I ever had in my life. We didn't stop until we reached the safety of her house, hearts pounding in our chests. We didn't talk much that night. Both of us were too shaken to speak, but we knew what we'd seen. There was something in that farmhouse, something ancient, something evil, and it was watching us. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't the only ones who had noticed the strange figures. I started hearing rumors at school, whispers about people disappearing from the town, strange sightings at the edge of the woods. But the most chilling of all was the story of Thomas, a local boy who had gone missing just a few months before. They found his body near the farmhouse, his eyes wide open in terror, his expression frozen in an unrecognizable scream. The cause of death was never determined, but the way his body was found, hands clutching his throat like he had been strangled, was enough to convince most people that there was something more to the stories than mere superstition. I couldn't get it out of my mind. I had to know what was happening at that farmhouse. I had to know the truth about the children of the Vale. So the following weekend, Grace and I made a plan. We would go back to the farmhouse, but this time we'd be prepared. We'd bring flashlights, cameras, anything we could use to document what we saw. We were going to find answers. When we arrived, the place was quiet. Too quiet. The chanting had stopped. The figures were gone. The farmhouse stood alone in the dark, its windows dark and empty. We hesitated at the front gate, unsure if we should proceed. But we pushed forward, our steps heavy on the gravel path. We reached the porch where the mannequin had once stood. It was gone. And in its place, carved into the wood of the doorframe, was a symbol, a circle with a line through it, a symbol I had seen in old books, describing the mark of the children of the Vale. We didn't have time to react. From behind us, we heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and closing in on us. We turned to face whatever was coming, and then everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying on the ground outside the farmhouse. Grace was beside me, shaking me gently, her face pale with fear. The house behind us was dark and still. No one had followed us, no one had come after us. But I knew they were there. I could feel it. Watching. Waiting. We left Hollow Creek shortly after that night, both of us unable to shake the feeling that the children of the Vale were still out there, lurking just beyond the edge of town. The farmhouse was abandoned again, but the stories persisted. People still went missing, and the whispering wind still carried the sounds of an ancient chant. Story the end.
Story number 2.
I had always been a skeptic, someone who brushed off ghost stories and urban legends as mere fantasy. I worked as a journalist in a small town, and when I wasn't writing, I spent my time exploring abandoned places, hoping to uncover some hidden piece of local history. So, when a colleague mentioned a rural village not far from where I lived, one with a history of disappearances and rumors of a sinister cult, I was intrigued but not convinced. The town was called Hollow Creek, and it had been abandoned decades ago after a string of unsolved deaths and mysterious occurrences. People still talk about it, my colleague said, leaning in with a conspiratorial grin. They say the cult's still out there, somewhere in the woods. I shrugged it off, but the idea of an abandoned town with a dark past lingered in my mind. It seemed like the perfect subject for an article. I decided to take a trip there and see for myself. The drive to Hollow Creek took a little over 2 hours, and by the time I arrived, it was late afternoon. The road leading into the town was narrow and winding, lined with thick trees that seemed to close in as I drove further. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but I ignored it. The town was supposed to be empty, after all. When I reached Hollow Creek, I immediately noticed the eerie silence. The place felt abandoned in every sense of the word, as though it had been frozen in time. There were no signs of life, no animals, no birds, just an oppressive quiet. I parked my car on the outskirts of town and got out, taking my camera and notebook with me. The houses were decaying, their windows shattered and doors hanging loosely from their frames. The paint on the buildings had long since peeled away and vines crawled up the walls. It was clear that no one had lived here in years. I started walking down the main street, taking pictures of the ruins. As I passed an old church at the center of town, I noticed something odd. The door was slightly ajar and there was a faint light flickering from within. I hesitated. It felt strange, out of place, but curiosity got the better of me. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit by what appeared to be candles, though I couldn't make out where the light was coming from. The air was thick with dust and an odd, musty scent. The pews were overturned, and the floor was covered in dirt and debris. But what caught my attention the most was the symbol carved into the wall at the far end of the room. It was a large, intricate design, almost like a pentagram, but with additional lines and markings that I didn't recognize. My heart started to race as I moved closer to inspect it. I pulled out my camera, but as I snapped a picture, I felt something cold brush against my neck. I spun around, but the room was empty. I told myself it was just the wind, but the chill remained. I left the church quickly, my nerves on edge, and continued down the street. It didn't take long before I found something even stranger. A large, circular stone structure hidden behind a row of overgrown houses. It was almost like a small amphitheater, with stone benches arranged in a circle around a central fire pit. I crouched down, examining the area. There were fresh scratches on the stone, deep and jagged, as though something or someone had been there recently. The air felt unnaturally cold in the center of the circle, and for the first time I started to feel uneasy. I stood up and took a few photos, but my hands were shaking now, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't until I heard the voices that I truly began to panic. The sound was distant at first, just a faint whisper, barely audible over the wind. But as I stood there, frozen, it grew louder, clearer. It was chanting in a language I couldn't understand. I turned, expecting to see someone behind me, but the clearing was empty. The voices grew louder, more insistent. They were coming from the woods. I looked toward the forest line, and for a brief moment I thought I saw movement, figures emerging from the trees, cloaked in dark robes. My breath caught in my throat. The chanting seemed to come from all directions now, surrounding me. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear. The figures stepped into the clearing, their faces hidden beneath their hoods. They didn't make a sound as they moved, their steps silent on the ground. I instinctively backed away, but they didn't follow. Instead, they gathered in the center of the stone circle, standing perfectly still. And then I saw it, a flash of light from the center of the circle, bright and blinding. My head spun, and I stumbled backward, falling to the ground. When I looked up, the figures were gone. The chanting had stopped, and the clearing was silent once more. I didn't know what had just happened, but I didn't wait around to find out. I scrambled to my feet and ran back to my car, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop until I was miles away from Hollow Creek, my hands still trembling on the wheel. That night, I tried to make sense of everything that had happened. I reviewed the photos I had taken, but there was nothing in them. No figures, no evidence of what I had seen. It was as if the entire encounter had been a figment of my imagination. I told myself I had been scared, maybe exhausted, and that my mind had played tricks on me. But deep down, I knew what I had experienced was real. I tried to shake it off, but over the following days, strange things started happening. At night, I would hear whispers in the dark, low, unintelligible voices that seemed to echo from the walls of my apartment. I dismissed them as nothing more than my overactive imagination, but the sounds grew louder. I began to feel like I was being watched. One evening, I decided to go back to Hollow Creek, determined to find some answers. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had missed something important, something I hadn't seen the first time. When I arrived, the town was even more desolate than before. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding, and the silence was suffocating. I made my way to the stone circle once again, but this time something was different. The ground around the circle was scorched. The earth blackened as if something had burned there recently. I knelt down to inspect the area, and that's when I saw it. A symbol similar to the one I had seen in the church, carved into the ground. But this one was fresh, as if it had been scratched into the earth only hours before. The air grew cold again, and the voices returned, closer now, clearer. The chanting was louder than ever, and I realized with a jolt that it was coming from the trees. I turned to leave, but the path was blocked by a figure. A man, dressed in a dark cloak, stood in front of me. His face was obscured by a hood, but I could feel his eyes on me. His presence was overwhelming, like he was pulling me toward him, forcing me to listen. "You shouldn't have come back," he whispered, his voice low and menacing. I tried to speak, to ask who he was, but the words caught in my throat. His grip tightened on my arm, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. "You're already part of it," he said, his voice barely audible above the chanting. "You've seen the truth, and now you can never leave." I pulled away from him, my heart racing. I ran, not stopping until I reached my car. I couldn't get away fast enough. I drove through the night, trying to escape the feeling that something was following me, something that would never let me go. I never returned to Hollow Creek. The town and the people who had once lived there remained a mystery to me, but I couldn't forget what I had seen or the chilling warning I had received. Years have passed since that day, but the voices still haunt me. They whisper to me in my dreams, in the silence of the night, reminding me that I am marked, that I can never escape the cult of Hollow Creek. Story, the end.
Story number 3.
I grew up in a small town named Ashwood, tucked away in the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest. It was a town that seemed to be constantly shrouded in fog, the kind that rolled in thick from the mountains and hung heavy in the air. Ashwood had a rich history, but much of it was buried under layers of silence and strange, half-remembered rumors. My family had lived there for generations, and we always joked that Ashwood was the sort of place where secrets had a tendency to stay buried. That was until I uncovered one of the town's oldest and darkest secrets. I was home visiting my parents one summer after being away for college when I first heard the rumors about the Hollow Oak. It was an old, twisted tree that stood at the edge of the town, its roots sprawling through the earth like the fingers of a giant hand. Locals rarely spoke of it directly, but whispers always followed. Some said it was a place of power, others called it cursed. But the most chilling tale I heard was from an old man at the diner one morning. "Folks don't go near the Hollow Oak anymore," he said, his voice grating like gravel. "Not since the cult came through. They did things, awful things. It's not right to disturb it, you hear?" I asked him what he meant by cult, but he only shook his head and clammed up, refusing to speak any further. His silence only intrigued me. Being away from Ashwood for so long had made me forget how deeply the town was tied to its own folklore. That night, after too many drinks with old friends, I found myself walking toward the Hollow Oak. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something I needed to understand about it, something left unsaid. The fog had rolled in, thicker than usual, and the air felt damp and cold, as if the tree itself was breathing. When I reached the edge of the forest, the tree loomed in front of me like a dark sentinel, its twisted branches reaching up to the sky like clawed fingers. I stood there for a moment, the sound of my breathing the only thing I could hear. Then something caught my eye, a faint light flickering deep within the woods. I couldn't tell if it was just my imagination, but it seemed to pulse with a rhythmic, almost hypnotic quality. Against my better judgment, I stepped closer. The light grew brighter as I moved, and soon I realized it wasn't just one light, but several. Candles arranged in a perfect circle around the base of the Hollow Oak. And then I saw them. Figures, draped in dark robes, standing silently around the circle. Their faces were obscured by hoods, but the air around them felt wrong, like it was vibrating with a quiet, oppressive energy. I couldn't bring myself to move, couldn't tear my eyes away from them. For a moment, I convinced myself they hadn't seen me, but then I felt it. A shift in the air, a coldness that made my skin prickle. One of the figures turned slowly, and I swear it looked directly at me. Its face was hidden beneath the hood, but I could feel its eyes on me, burning through the darkness. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized they weren't just standing there in silence, they were waiting for something or someone. Before I could react, a voice echoed out from the group. It was low and guttural, a language I couldn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable, commanding, powerful, filled with a deep, ancient malice. The figures began to chant in unison, their words flowing like a river of dark energy that seemed to seep into the very earth beneath me. I wanted to run. My body screamed for me to turn and flee, but I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear and fascination. The chanting grew louder, more intense, and the ground beneath my feet began to tremble. Suddenly, one of the figures stepped forward, breaking the circle. I could feel its gaze on me, even though its face remained hidden. It raised a hand, and the chanting stopped, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in its wake. "You shouldn't have come here," the figure said, its voice smooth and cold, like the whisper of wind through dead branches. "This is no place for you." I tried to speak, to ask what they were doing, but my throat felt tight, as if the air itself was choking me. "The Hollow Oak has been a place of power for centuries," the figure continued, its voice softening, almost hypnotic, "and those who seek to understand it often find themselves trapped within it. You too will become a part of it. The town of Ashwood belongs to us, and you cannot leave." I stepped back, my mind reeling. The words didn't make sense, but the terror I felt in that moment was all too real. The figure reached out toward me, its hand stretched like a claw, and the world seemed to go black for a split second. When I came to, I was lying on the ground, the hollow oak towering above me like a silent witness to something unspeakable. The fog had thickened, and the chanting had stopped. The figures were gone. I scrambled to my feet, heart racing, and made my way back toward town, never once looking back. Over the next few days, I tried to make sense of what had happened. My friends noticed I was different, quieter, withdrawn. I couldn't explain what I'd seen, or rather, what I thought I'd seen. My mind kept going back to the figure that had spoken to me. Its voice echoed in my head, and I felt a nagging sense of dread that something terrible was about to happen. It was then that I learned the truth. The cult had been active in Ashwood decades ago, a group of individuals who believed the Hollow Oak was a conduit to a dark force, something that existed beyond the veil of the living world. They had performed rituals there, sacrifices, dark invocations, all in an attempt to call forth this entity. Most of the cult had disappeared mysteriously, but the town had suffered ever since. People spoke of strange occurrences, missing persons, and unexplained deaths. The cult had left its mark on Ashwood, and I had unknowingly become a part of that story. As the days passed, I began to feel like I was being watched. A lingering presence, always in the periphery of my thoughts. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The chanting I had heard still echoed in my mind, and I couldn't help but feel that the Hollow Oak was calling to me again. It was only after I tried to leave Ashwood, packing up and heading for a new life, that the true horror revealed itself. As I walked away from the town, I looked back one last time and saw it. There, at the edge of the forest, the hollow oak was standing tall, its branches twisting like dark skeletal fingers. And in the distance, I could hear it again, the chanting, faint but unmistakable. The figures in the robes were waiting for me to return. I never made it out of Ashwood. And now, every night, when the wind howls through the trees, I can hear the chant calling to me, pulling me back toward the hollow oak, back to the cult and the darkness they had summoned. Story the end.
Story number 4.
I had been warned. I moved to the small town of Rivers Bend on a whim. It was supposed to be a fresh start, quiet, peaceful, far from the chaos of city life. The house I rented was an old farmhouse just outside of town, tucked away by a dense stretch of woods. The rent was cheap, and the land was beautiful. The trees seemed to swallow the house whole, the thick canopy casting a shadow over the property, even at midday. But something about it appealed to me. I didn't mind the isolation, and the thought of spending my mornings in the silence of nature, surrounded by woods and wildlife, seemed like the perfect way to recharge. The townsfolk weren't unfriendly, but they were distant, and they never spoke much about the woods. I noticed this quickly. Whenever I asked them about the forest that bordered the property, they gave me vague answers. "It's better not to go in too deep," they'd say. "The woods have a way of messing with people's heads." I shrugged it off as local superstition. After all, I had lived in various places before, and the idea of cursed lands and dark forests always seemed like something out of a storybook. But one afternoon, as I was walking down the town's main street, I overheard something that made me pause. A man, likely in his late 60s, was talking to the bartender at the local pub. His voice was low, but the words still cut through the noise around me. "They're still out there, you know," the man muttered. "Some say they've moved on, but I don't believe it. You can't escape that kind of evil. I wasn't sure if he was talking about a person or something else, but the way the bartender nodded almost sympathetically made my skin crawl. Before I could ask what they were referring to, the man stood up and walked out of the bar, leaving a thick tension in the air. I tried to ignore the conversation and move on with my day. It was probably just some small-town gossip. But that night, something happened that would make me realize just how wrong I was to dismiss those warnings. The first night I noticed the sounds from the woods. I thought it was nothing more than the usual rustling of leaves or the call of an animal. But as the days went by, the sounds grew more distinct, distant chanting. It was faint at first, just barely audible in the silence of the night. It was a deep, guttural sound, rhythmic and unrelenting. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone felt wrong. It sent a shiver down my spine every time I heard it. At first, I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Wind through the trees, maybe, or animals in the forest. But every night, the chanting grew louder, closer. There were times when I could swear it was coming from just beyond my property line, at the edge of the trees. I began to feel like something was watching me, waiting for me to venture too far. The following weekend, curiosity got the better of me. I decided to take a walk through the woods. Maybe it was nothing, and I was just letting my imagination run wild. I wasn't sure what I expected to find, but I had to see for myself. I followed the overgrown trail that led into the forest. The deeper I walked, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The trees seemed to close in around me, their twisted branches blocking out the light. The air was thick with dampness and the smell of decaying leaves. There was a strange quiet to the woods, a stillness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I ventured further, I noticed something strange. There, in a small clearing, was a circle of stones. The rocks were old, covered in moss, and arranged in a perfect ring. The ground inside the circle was disturbed, as if someone had recently dug there. My heart began to race. I crouched down to examine the earth, and that's when I saw it. A symbol carved into the dirt, a jagged, twisted shape that seemed to pulse with an energy I couldn't explain. Suddenly, I heard the chanting again, louder this time. I stood up quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. The voices were closer now, too close. I turned around, but no one was there. The chanting was coming from the trees. There were people out there, hidden in the shadows. I could feel their presence, and I knew I had to leave. I ran back toward the path, my breath coming in short gasps. As I neared the edge of the woods, I caught a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision. Figures in dark robes standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, their heads lowered. Panic surged through me, and I sprinted the rest of the way back to the house, barely stopping to catch my breath. I slammed the door behind me, locked all the windows, and collapsed against the wall, trying to process what had just happened. The next morning, I decided to leave. I packed a bag, grabbed my things, and drove to the nearest town to stay in a motel. But even as I tried to escape, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, something dark and relentless. The motel room was small and dreary, but it was better than being in that house. I tried to distract myself by watching TV, but the sound of the chanting wouldn't leave my head. It echoed through the walls, getting louder with every passing minute. I stood up, my knees shaking, and walked to the window. There, across the parking lot, I saw them again. Figures, standing in the shadows, just outside the tree line. I couldn't escape them. The next day, I called the local police, hoping they could help me understand what was happening. I wasn't sure what to tell them. How could I explain that I had seen people in the woods, chanting in a language I didn't understand, performing rituals? The officer who arrived was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a tired face. I told him everything, how I had found the stone circle, the symbols, the chanting. He listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he let out a long sigh. "You're not the first to come to us with this," he said quietly. "A lot of people around here have heard it, seen it. We've had a few disappearances over the years, people who wandered too far into those woods, people who tried to get too close to the cult." "The cult?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "The Hollow," he said grimly. "A group of people who worship something ancient in those woods. They believe the land is cursed and that it holds power, dark power. It's been going on for generations. The town used to be full of people, but they started disappearing. The few who remained, well, they don't talk about it. It's better not to. He paused, looking out the window toward the trees. I don't know what they're doing out there, but I've heard the chanting too. It's not something you can ignore. If I were you, I'd stay away from those woods. I left Rivers Bend that same afternoon, but the haunting didn't stop. The chanting followed me, even in my dreams. The faces of the people I had seen in the woods, pale and cold, hovered in the back of my mind, always watching, always waiting. I tried to move on, tried to forget about it, but I couldn't. The hollow had marked me, and I could feel its pull every day like a shadow just beyond my reach. And sometimes when the wind is still, I can hear the chanting again, calling me back to the woods. Story the end.
Story number 5.
I never believed in ghosts or cults. Not really. Ashwood was a small town, and like most small towns, it had its share of strange rumors. But there were also certain things you just didn't ask about. One of those things was the land just outside of town, a dark stretch of woods known as Widow's Hollow. There were only a few old-timers left in Ashwood who remembered when the place had a different name, the Hollow of the Forgotten, but even they didn't talk much about it. It was the kind of place you gave a wide berth to, whether you believed the stories or not. People had just learned to leave it alone. So when I found myself back in Ashwood after years of being away, I figured I was safe to ignore it too. That was until I met the strangers. It was a crisp fall evening when I first saw them. 3 figures, cloaked in heavy, dark robes, standing at the edge of the forest. At first I thought it was some kind of Halloween prank, but then I noticed how still they were, standing perfectly still as if they were waiting for something. The figures didn't move, even as I stared at them from the safety of my car. I wasn't sure if I should turn around or drive past them. My instinct told me to leave, but curiosity gnawed at me. After a few seconds, I forced myself to look away and drove off, but I couldn't shake the image of them standing there, silent, unmoving. The next day I went to the diner for lunch, hoping to shake the uneasy feeling. The place was bustling with familiar faces, the same ones I remembered from high school. It was comforting in a way, but something was off. I overheard a conversation at the counter, the low murmur of voices speaking about the strangers I'd seen. They say they're just passing through, one of the men muttered, his voice laced with an unease I hadn't expected. But I don't trust them. There's something wrong about those people. I saw them near Widow's Hollow again last night, right by the old well. Shut your mouth, Daryl, said the waitress, shaking her head. You're just spinning stories. There ain't no cults or ghosts in Ashwood. I stayed quiet, not wanting to add to the gossip, but I couldn't help but feel unsettled. Why were they hanging around Widow's Hollow? Why did they give off such an odd vibe? Later that evening, I decided to take a walk. The crisp air helped clear my mind, and I figured a stroll through the town would do me some good. As I neared the edge of town where the road curved toward the woods, I hesitated. I had never been one to be superstitious, but something tugged at my gut, warning me away from the path leading into Widow's Hollow. But I ignored it. I was determined not to let the stories of the past take hold of me. I walked a little farther, my steps slowing as I approached the entrance to the woods. There, at the edge of the trees, I saw them again. The same 3 figures standing in the same place. My heart skipped a beat. They hadn't moved. For a moment, I thought about calling out, but something in the air made me hesitate. It was like the atmosphere itself was thick with tension. The air was damp and still, and the rustle of the leaves beneath my feet seemed too loud in the silence. Before I could turn to leave, one of the figures moved. Slowly, it stepped forward. I felt a chill creep up my spine as it raised its hooded head, revealing nothing beneath the hood but darkness. It didn't speak, but it felt like it was watching me, its presence heavy in the air. A voice behind me broke the tension. You shouldn't be here. I whirled around, heart pounding. The voice belonged to an old man, a local who I recognized but couldn't place. His face was pale, his eyes wild with a kind of fear I hadn't seen in years. They're the ones, you see, he said in a whisper, eyes darting nervously toward the figures. The ones who came to town years ago, the ones who never left. I didn't ask him what he meant. I didn't want to know. They used to call them the Children of the Hollow, he continued. A cult. They came to this town a long time ago, looking for something buried deep in those woods. My stomach twisted as I glanced back at the figures. What do they want? The old man shook his head violently, as if the very thought terrified him. I don't know, but they've been here for years. I thought they were gone, but they never leave. They'll take anyone who dares to get too close. Don't go near them. Don't go near that damn place. I wanted to run, but I was frozen. My feet wouldn't move. I didn't dare look back at the three figures standing motionless in the shadows. Suddenly, the old man grabbed my arm and pulled me back. His fingers were cold, like death itself had touched me. Get out of here. Go, he urged, his voice hoarse. I don't remember how I managed to escape that night. My mind was too muddled with fear and confusion to think straight. But I found myself back at my parents' house, the safety of the familiar walls offering me a fragile sense of peace. I tried to shake the thoughts of the cult from my mind, but every night the same image kept haunting me. The dark figures standing in the fog, waiting. I felt like I was being drawn toward them, like there was something I had to understand, some terrible truth hidden in that cursed forest. Days passed, and the unease didn't fade. My dreams were plagued with images of dark figures, chanting in an eerie, unknown language, their faces obscured beneath black hoods. I could hear the wind howling through the trees, their whispers clawing at the edges of my consciousness. I couldn't let it go. I had to know what they were, what they wanted. So, one evening, I returned to the woods. This time, I wasn't alone. I brought my friend Sarah with me, someone I trusted to keep me grounded. We walked together toward the edge of the forest, the air heavy with foreboding. She didn't know the full extent of what I'd seen, but she could feel the tension too. When we reached the clearing near Widow's Hollow, there was no sign of the figures. No cloaked strangers waiting in the shadows. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but it was quickly replaced by dread. Then I heard it. A faint sound, barely perceptible at first, a low chant rising from the depths of the trees. I turned to Sarah. She was looking at me with wide eyes, her lips parted in fear. "What is that?" she asked, her voice trembling. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Because I knew in that moment that the figures hadn't gone anywhere. They were waiting for someone like me, someone who had dared to seek out the truth. We didn't stay long after that. The chanting grew louder, more intense, and the air became thick with an energy I couldn't explain. I grabbed Sarah's hand, pulling her back the way we had come. When we reached the edge of the woods, I turned back one last time, and that's when I saw them. The figures, standing just inside the trees, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. And in that moment, I knew I would never be free. They had claimed me. They had claimed Ashwood, and nothing would ever be the same again. Story the end.
Story number 6.
It started with a dream. At least, I thought it was a dream at first. A group of hooded figures standing in a circle, chanting words I couldn't understand. The trees around them swayed unnaturally, and the sky above was dark, more like twilight than night. It wasn't a nightmare, but it wasn't peaceful either. The air was heavy, thick with a sense of foreboding. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding, and tried to shake the feeling of unease. But that dream was just the beginning. I had recently moved to a quiet town called Windfall. It was isolated, nestled deep within the woods, far from the nearest city. When I first arrived, everything seemed peaceful. Too peaceful. The locals were polite, but their conversations always seemed to edge around certain topics. The woods were one of them. At first, I didn't think much of it. I had heard all sorts of small-town rumors before, but the atmosphere of the place felt off. The air always smelled of wet earth and pine, the forest pressing against the edges of the town like an unseen hand. People rarely ventured into the woods, and when they did, it was always in groups. When I asked one of the locals, a woman named Margaret, about it, she only smiled nervously and said, "It's just the way it is. Some things are better left undisturbed." Still, I couldn't shake my curiosity. I had always been interested in local legends and abandoned places, so I decided to explore the woods for myself. The following weekend, I set out early in the morning with a backpack and a camera. I told myself it was just an ordinary hike, but something about the idea of being in those woods felt different. Almost like I was being drawn there, pulled by something I couldn't understand. The forest was dense, the trees towering above me, their gnarled roots twisting across the ground. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. No birds, no rustling of small animals. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. After an hour of walking, I found myself in a small clearing. It was beautiful in a strange way. Sunlight filtered through the branches above, casting long, broken beams of light onto the forest floor. But what caught my attention wasn't the sunlight. It was the remnants of something older, something sinister. In the center of the clearing stood a circle of stones, uneven and weathered by time. There were markings on them, scratches and symbols carved deep into the rock. I knelt down to examine them, my heart racing. I had seen similar symbols in books about ancient rituals, but never in person. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I quickly stood, backing away from the circle. As I turned to leave, I heard something, a soft rustling in the trees. I froze. It wasn't an animal. It was the unmistakable sound of human footsteps. Slowly, I turned around, my heart pounding in my chest. A figure stepped into the clearing. A man, tall and thin, with a hood obscuring most of his face. His clothes were tattered, and there was a strange, almost unnatural stillness about him. He stood silently for a long moment, as if waiting for something. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. The man didn't move, didn't blink. It felt like time had stopped. My breath caught in my throat, and I could feel my pulse in my ears, the blood rushing in my head. "Are you lost?" I managed to ask, my voice trembling. The man didn't answer. Instead, he stepped toward the stones, lifting his hands as if in a silent prayer. He muttered something under his breath, words that sounded foreign, ancient. The ground beneath my feet seemed to vibrate, and I stumbled back, my eyes wide with panic. Suddenly, the air around me grew cold, frigid, unnatural. The trees creaked in the wind, but it was a hollow, unsettling sound, as though they were groaning in pain. I could feel the presence of others hidden just out of sight, watching from the edges of the clearing. I didn't know how I knew, but I could feel them. There were more of them, and they were closing in. I turned and ran, the sounds of footsteps behind me growing louder, though I didn't dare look back. My breath came in ragged gasps as I pushed myself harder, the trees whipping past me. The woods had always felt oppressive, but now it felt like they were closing in, the shadows stretching and shifting, reaching for me. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the forest, where the sunlight seemed to break through, and I felt the weight lifting from my chest. I collapsed on the ground, trembling uncontrollably. For a long time, I just lay there, trying to catch my breath. I didn't know what had just happened, but something told me that it wasn't over. The next few days were a blur of fear and confusion. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, that I was being watched. Every time I stepped outside, I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye. Figures, always just out of reach, vanishing when I looked directly at them. I tried to dismiss it as nerves, as the remnants of the fear from that day in the woods. But one night, as I was sitting in my small apartment, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was a chant, faint but unmistakable, coming from the direction of the forest. It was the same chant I had heard in the clearing. I stood frozen, my heart hammering in my chest. The chant grew louder, filling the air around me, and I realized with a sickening certainty that it wasn't just my imagination. They were out there, watching, waiting. The next morning, I went to the local sheriff, an older man named Jack. He listened to me in silence, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he looked out the window for a long moment before speaking. "Listen, I'm going to tell you something, but you're not going to believe me," he said quietly. I leaned forward, the weight of what he might say pressing down on me. "What is it?" "There's a reason people stay out of those woods," he said. "Years ago, there was a cult, old as the town itself, who worshipped something dark. They believed the woods were sacred, that there was power there. They would perform rituals, sacrifices, and some say they still do. The town was built on top of something ancient. People started disappearing, kids, young people, anyone who ventured too far. The cult would take them." I felt my stomach turn. "But what happened to them? The people who disappeared?" Sheriff Jack glanced around, lowering his voice. "They were never found. Some say the cult has a way of making people disappear, erasing them from existence. The ones who survive, well, they leave. No one stays here long enough to ask questions, and the ones who do stay, they don't talk about it. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had already crossed a line, one I couldn't uncross. As the days passed, the chanting grew louder, closer. It felt like the cult was closing in on me, drawing me into the woods, forcing me to come back. That's when I found out the truth. One night, in a moment of terror, I decided to return to the clearing, to face whatever had been haunting me. I don't know what I expected to find, but when I stepped into the woods, I saw them. Dozens of figures in hooded cloaks, standing in a circle around the stones. They were chanting, their voices rising in unison, and at the center of the circle, there was something dark, something ancient. I was frozen, unable to move as the chanting grew louder, like it was vibrating inside my skull. I tried to back away, but the ground beneath me seemed to shift, and I tripped, falling hard on the ground. The last thing I remember before everything went black was the sound of footsteps coming toward me, getting closer and closer. When I woke up, I was back in my apartment. It was morning, but something felt different. I couldn't explain it. There was a strange, dark energy in the air, and I knew without a doubt that I was no longer alone. Something had marked me, and now it was never going to let me go. Story the end.
Story number 7.
I wasn't supposed to be back in Ashwood. After I left for college, I made a promise to myself that I wouldn't return. The town was small, suffocating, and had its secrets that were better left untouched. But life, as it often does, had a way of pulling me back. I had inherited my grandmother's old house after she passed, and the bank was pushing me to take care of it. So reluctantly, I came back. When I first arrived, things felt out of the ordinary. The town still looked the same. Old, weathered houses with creaking porches, the same diner where the elderly men gathered for coffee every morning, and the same fog that rolled in from the mountains at dusk. But something felt off, as though the town had changed beneath the surface, in ways I couldn't quite understand. One evening, a few weeks after my return, I decided to take a walk through the woods behind my grandmother's house. It was a path I used to walk as a child, a place where I would escape from the quiet pressure of the town. I hadn't thought much about it at the time, but as I walked deeper into the forest, the feeling of unease crept up on me. I reached the clearing where the old stone well stood, the one my grandmother had told me stories about when I was younger. She used to warn me to never go near it. But back then, I didn't understand why. Now, as I stood there, gazing down into the dark depths of the well, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. It wasn't just the usual feeling of being alone in the woods. This was something different, a presence that seemed to be hanging in the air, suffocating and oppressive. I looked around, expecting to see something, anything, but the woods were still, save for the occasional rustle of leaves. That was when I heard it, a soft whisper, barely audible over the sound of the wind. My name. I froze. Sarah. I spun around, but there was no one there, just the trees, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. For a moment, I wondered if I had imagined it, but deep down, I knew it wasn't my mind playing tricks. I turned to leave, but then I saw them. 3 figures standing at the edge of the clearing. They were cloaked in black, their faces hidden beneath deep hoods. I couldn't see their eyes, but I could feel their gaze, cold and penetrating, watching me. Before I could move, one of them stepped forward. It was a woman, though I couldn't tell her age or even her features, her face obscured by the shadows of her hood. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice low and almost musical. "This place belongs to us." I wanted to speak, to ask what she meant, but the words wouldn't come. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my limbs felt like lead. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or even respond. "The hollow oak," she continued, her voice growing colder, "it has a purpose you can't begin to understand. Leave now, before it's too late." I tried to take a step back, but the ground beneath my feet felt like it was shifting, as though the earth itself was pushing me forward. "I know what you're thinking," the woman said, almost as if reading my mind. "You want to know more, but some things are better left buried." The other 2 figures remained silent, standing motionless as they watched me. I couldn't see their faces, but I could feel the weight of their presence. There was a tension in the air, like a storm was about to break. The whispering in the wind grew louder, and for a moment, I thought I could hear something else. Voices, faint and indistinct, calling from deeper within the forest. Without warning, the woman reached out and grabbed my arm. Her touch was cold, like ice, sending a jolt of fear through my body. "Do not return," she whispered, her breath cold against my skin. "If you do, it will be the last time you leave." I tried to pull away, but her grip tightened. In that moment, I understood that whatever they weren't human. They were something else, something ancient and malevolent. Before I could react, she released me, and the figures vanished into the shadows, as if they were never there to begin with. I stood in the clearing, trembling, my mind racing. What had just happened? What did they mean? The words echoed in my head, but I couldn't make sense of them. I didn't return to the woods that night. Instead, I stumbled back to my grandmother's house, my heart still racing, my mind haunted by the encounter, but the strange feeling of being watched never left me. The next few days passed in a blur. I tried to shake off the fear, to tell myself it was just some twisted dream or hallucination. But something kept pulling at me, a compulsion to understand. I couldn't stop thinking about the hollow oak, the woman's warning, the chilling sensation of their eyes on me. That night, I decided to return to the woods. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to know what was going on, what secret Ashwood was hiding. I went alone, despite my better judgment. The woods seemed different at night. The darkness was thicker, more oppressive, and the silence felt unnatural, as if even the wind was afraid to make a sound. When I reached the clearing, I saw them again. The three figures stood at the same spot, waiting for me. "You shouldn't have come," the woman said, her voice filled with cold disappointment. "We warned you." I didn't answer. I couldn't. I was too terrified to speak, but I had to know. "What do you want?" I managed to choke out. "The hollow oak calls to those who seek power," she replied. "It feeds on fear, and those who disturb it become part of its curse." I didn't understand what she meant, but before I could ask, the ground beneath my feet trembled. The air grew heavy, thick, with an unseen force. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body refused to obey. I was rooted to the spot. The figures began to chant in low, guttural voices. Their words were incomprehensible, but they sent a wave of dread through me, deep into my bones. The forest around me seemed to shift, the trees groaning as if they were alive, watching. I tried to scream, but the words caught in my throat. The earth beneath me cracked open, and I felt a cold, shadowy presence rising from the ground. I could see nothing, but I could feel it, something ancient, something evil, pulling me toward it. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The chanting ceased, the ground stopped trembling, and the oppressive weight lifted from the air. I was alone in the clearing again. The figures were gone, and the woods were silent, save for the rustle of the leaves in the breeze. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the safety of my grandmother's house. But the fear didn't leave me. It followed me, every step, every breath. I couldn't escape the feeling that the hollow oak had claimed me, just as it had claimed others before me. The next morning, I packed up my things and left Ashwood. I couldn't stay there any longer. But even now, years later, I still feel it. The pull, the presence, the haunting whispers of those figures in the woods. And no matter how far I go, I can't escape the feeling that they're still waiting for me. Story the end.
Story number 8.
I moved to the small town of Harrow Creek for a fresh start. It was the kind of place that seemed to have fallen off the map. Quiet, isolated, with little more than a handful of houses and a single main street. The town had that sleepy, postcard-perfect quality that made it seem like a safe haven from the rush of city life. But I soon realized that Harrow Creek wasn't the idyllic little town it seemed to be. When I arrived, I rented a modest cottage just outside town. The house sat at the edge of the woods, the trees pressing in like a barrier to the world beyond. The first few days were peaceful. I spent my time unpacking, getting to know the town, and slowly settling in. But there was something about the woods that I couldn't quite shake. At first, I chalked it up to nerves or just unfamiliarity with my new surroundings, but the feeling didn't go away. One evening, as I was walking into town to grab some supplies, I passed an older woman sitting on her porch. She gave me a long, measured look before speaking. "You're the new one, right?" she asked, her voice raspy like she hadn't spoken in days. "Yes," I answered, trying to smile. "I just moved in." She nodded, though her eyes never left mine. "The woods aren't friendly. Not for you. Not for anyone." I chuckled, assuming she was just an eccentric local. "I'll keep that in mind. Thanks." But she didn't smile back. Her face was serious, her gaze steady. "The cult is still out there. They'll find you, just like they found the others." Her words hung in the air between us like a cloud of smoke, thick with something I couldn't quite place. "What do you mean by cult?" I asked, a bit confused, unsure if she was speaking figuratively or something else. But she didn't answer. She just looked at me as though she had already said all she was going to say. I walked away, feeling a shiver run down my spine. It wasn't the first time I'd heard strange things about the woods. The locals rarely spoke about it directly, but every so often I'd catch a glimpse of fear in their eyes when I mentioned it. It was as if the forest itself held a secret, something they didn't want to acknowledge but couldn't quite forget. Later that evening, I decided to go for a walk in the woods. I wasn't superstitious, and I figured I'd better explore the area if I was going to live here. The air was damp, thick with the scent of pine and earth. The forest was dense, the canopy above blocking out most of the light. I ventured deeper, feeling a strange sense of unease building inside me. I don't know how long I walked, but when I came across the clearing, I felt a sudden jolt in my chest. The trees parted to reveal a wide circle of stones. At first, it looked like any old stone circle, weathered and ancient, but something about it felt wrong. The stones were marked with symbols, deep carvings that seemed to pulse with an energy I couldn't explain. I knelt down to inspect one, my fingers grazing the cold, rough surface, when I heard a rustling in the bushes behind me. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood up and backed away, unsure whether I had heard something or if my mind was playing tricks on me. I turned to leave, but the air grew heavier, the silence deeper. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I didn't want to, but I glanced back at the stone circle. That's when I saw them, figures standing just beyond the stones, hidden in the shadows of the trees. Their eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and I could feel the weight of their gaze. My breath caught in my throat, and I knew without a doubt that they weren't just people. I turned and fled back toward the path, my footsteps loud in the silence of the woods. I didn't stop running until I reached my cottage, where I slammed the door shut behind me and bolted it. My pulse was still racing, my breath shallow. I tried to convince myself it was just an overactive imagination. Maybe someone had been hiking in the woods, or maybe it was just an animal. But the next few nights, the same thing happened. The whispers in the trees, the glowing eyes just beyond my vision. I began to feel like I wasn't alone anymore. One night, as I sat in my living room trying to distract myself with a book, I heard a soft knock at the door. I froze. It was late, way too late for a visitor. I hesitated, wondering if I should ignore it, but curiosity got the better of me. I opened the door only to find an old man standing on the porch, his face shadowed by the hood of his coat. He looked at me with pale, hollow eyes, and I immediately felt a chill creep down my spine. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice more tentative than I intended. "I'm sorry to disturb you," he said in a low voice, his tone almost hypnotic. "But you've gone too far. They know you're here. The cult is watching. They've seen you." I took a step back, suddenly afraid. "What are you talking about?" "You found their circle, didn't you?" His gaze was piercing, and for the first time I understood what people meant when they said someone could look straight through you. "You need to leave. If you don't, they'll take you too." I tried to speak, but he raised a hand, silencing me. "I'm not here to help you. I'm here to warn you. Once they have you, there's no coming back. They'll claim you, just like the others." Before I could respond, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the night, as if he had never been there at all. I stood in the doorway, too stunned to move. The man's words echoed in my mind. The cult had seen me. They were watching. And I had already crossed a line I couldn't uncross. The next day, I spoke to Margaret again, desperate for answers. "You were right," I said, my voice shaking. "I found the stone circle in the woods. I don't know what's going on, but something isn't right. People have been watching me, and Margaret didn't let me finish. Her face grew pale, her hands trembling as she held onto the edge of her porch. "You don't understand," she whispered. "The cult, they don't just watch. They take. They've been here for years. They come out of the woods and they take people. They take your soul. They're bound to the land, to the forest, and once you've been marked, there's no escape." I was about to ask what she meant when I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. I turned, but no one was there. "They're here," she said softly, backing away from the edge of the porch. "They've come for you." I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck and turned around. There, standing in the shadows of the trees, were the figures from the clearing. I could see their eyes now, glowing faintly, a sickly yellow. They didn't move, didn't speak, but I knew they were waiting for something. I ran. I ran faster than I ever had before, not daring to look back as I heard the sound of footsteps behind me, getting closer with every passing second. When I reached the edge of the forest, I could still hear their voices, whispers in the trees, just out of reach. But I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I left Harrow Creek that night. I don't know if the cult is still out there or if they've taken others, but I know this. I will never set foot in that town again. And no matter how far I go, I can still hear the whispers in the trees. Story the end.
Story number 9.
I've lived in the small town of Ravenbrook my entire life, and despite its quiet charm, it has its share of dark history. Most people in town tend to keep their heads down, not asking questions, not digging too deep. But I always had a knack for curiosity, and that curiosity led me to something that changed my life forever. It all started one cold autumn evening when I was walking home from the library. The sky was darkening earlier than usual, and a thick fog had started rolling in from the nearby hills. As I walked along the cobbled streets, I noticed something unusual. A group of strangers had gathered near the town square. They wore long, tattered black robes, their faces obscured by hoods, and their hushed conversations were drowned out by the thick, choking fog. At first, I thought they might be tourists, but there was something about the way they moved, as if they were waiting for something, or someone. I quickly turned down a side street, trying not to stare, but a voice in the back of my head told me that something wasn't right. The next day, I couldn't shake the image of those strangers from my mind. I didn't know why, but it felt like I had seen them before, like I had read about them in one of the old town books. My curiosity got the best of me, and I decided to visit the town's local library the next morning to see if I could find any mention of them. When I walked in, I was greeted by Mrs. Carter, the librarian. She was an elderly woman who had worked at the library for as long as anyone could remember. Her face was kind, but her eyes always seemed distant, as if she was looking at something that no one else could see. "You're here to do some research, dear?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. "Yeah," I said. "I saw something strange last night, a group of people in robes. I thought maybe I could find some history about them in the old records." Mrs. Carter paused for a moment, her gaze shifting toward the back of the library, where rows of dusty, neglected books sat on shelves. "You won't find much about them here, child," she said softly. "But if you're determined, I suppose I can help." We walked together to a back room, the air thick with the smell of old paper and dust. Mrs. Carter pulled a large, leather-bound book from the shelf, one that looked much older than anything else in the room. She handed it to me cautiously, her fingers trembling slightly as they brushed against mine. "The Ravenbrook Chronicles," she said. "This is all we have left of the town's history. But be warned, some things are better left unknown." I thanked her and sat down at one of the wooden tables. As I opened the book, I began to read. The pages were filled with accounts of Ravenbrook's early settlers, but as I reached the later chapters, the entries grew darker. There were mentions of strange rituals, of people disappearing, and whispers of a cult that had existed in the town long before I was born. They were known as the Black Covenant. According to the book, the Black Covenant had been active for centuries, a secretive group that practiced ancient rites deep in the woods surrounding Ravenbrook. The townspeople had always been afraid of them, but it wasn't until the 1800s that the cult's activities became more dangerous. Rituals were performed at midnight, and it was said that the group made sacrifices to something unknown, something that could not be named. The The further I read, the more disturbed I became. There were rumors that the cult had been involved in the disappearance of several townsfolk over the years, but the town authorities had always swept it under the rug. The more I read, the more I realized that the cult's influence was deeply entrenched in Ravenbrook's history, and it had never truly disappeared. Suddenly, a voice broke through my thoughts. "You should stop reading," Mrs. Carter said, standing in the doorway. "I told you, some things are better left unknown." I looked up at her, startled. "What do you mean? This is the history of Ravenbrook, isn't it?" She sighed heavily, walking toward me. "The Black Covenant has never left. They still live among us, hidden in plain sight. They are not just a part of Ravenbrook's past, they are a part of its present. And if you keep digging, you might just find yourself tangled up in something you can't escape." Her words sent a chill down my spine, but my curiosity only grew stronger. What are they still doing? Why don't people talk about them? Mrs. Carter's face darkened, her lips tight with fear. "They do their work in secret, using fear to control the town. People are too afraid to speak out. They know what the Covenant is capable of. I'm telling you this for your own good, child. Leave it alone." But I couldn't. I couldn't just walk away, not after everything I had read. I thanked Mrs. Carter and promised to leave soon. But I stayed, poring over every page, every story that had been buried in the town's history. The deeper I delved, the more I began to understand. The Black Covenant wasn't just a group of zealots. They were something far darker, far older. That night, I decided to investigate further. I had learned enough to know that the cult still operated from a hidden location deep in the woods, but no one had been able to pinpoint exactly where. The book mentioned an old church, abandoned and forgotten, where the cult would gather for their rituals. It was said to be somewhere near the edge of town, though it had been abandoned for decades. I couldn't resist. I grabbed a flashlight and set out toward the woods, the fog thick and heavy in the air. The trees loomed over me like dark, twisted sentinels, and every rustle of the leaves made my heart race faster. I walked for what felt like hours, the sound of my footsteps muffled by the fog. Finally, I found it. The church was barely standing, its crumbling stone walls half devoured by vines and decay. The door was ajar, and as I pushed it open, a rush of cold air hit me, carrying the faintest trace of something metallic and bitter. I stepped inside, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The church was empty, save for the broken pews and the shattered remnants of old candles scattered across the floor. But as I moved deeper into the building, I heard it. The faint whisper of voices, chanting, low and eerie, echoing from the shadows. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze in place. The air felt heavier, thicker, as if something was watching me, waiting for me to make the next move. I backed away slowly, but my foot caught on something soft, like fabric. I looked down, and that's when I saw it, a black robe lying discarded on the ground, and not just one, but several. My stomach churned as I realized that the cult had been here, right under my nose. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me, a soft rustling, then a low, cold voice whispered in my ear, "You shouldn't have come." I spun around, but there was nothing there. The air was still, but the fear settled into my bones like a weight. I turned and fled, running as fast as I could through the woods, the darkness closing in around me. When I finally made it back to town, my mind was reeling. What had I seen? What had I stumbled into? Over the next few days, strange things started happening. I would hear whispers in the streets, voices calling my name in the dark, shadows moving where there should be none. I began to feel like I was being watched, like something was lurking just out of sight, waiting to claim me. I knew I couldn't stay in Ravenbrook any longer. I couldn't shake the feeling that the Black Covenant was watching me, waiting for the right moment to pull me back into their grasp. So I left. I packed up and left Ravenbrook behind, hoping to escape the shadows that still followed me. But even now, I still hear the whispers, faint but persistent, echoing in the back of my mind. And every now and then, when the fog rolls in thick and heavy, I can't help but wonder if they're still out there watching, waiting for me to return. Story the end.
Story number 10.
I had never believed in ghosts or anything supernatural. I was a skeptic through and through, always chalking strange events up to coincidence or overactive imaginations. That all changed the summer I moved to the small town of Black Hollow. Black Hollow was the kind of place that most people drive through without a second thought. A handful of houses, a general store, and a few small roads winding through dense woods. It was the sort of place that seemed stuck in time, like a relic from a bygone era. But something about it pulled me in. I needed a fresh start, and this little town seemed perfect for it. The house I rented was an old Victorian, tucked away on the edge of town. It had the kind of charm you see in historical homes: tall windows, creaky floorboards, and dark wood trim. But there was an oddity to it that I couldn't quite place. The air always felt heavy, as if something was pressing down on the house, making it feel a bit suffocating. But I brushed it off. I had moved to this quiet place to escape the chaos of city life, and the house was just another part of the transition. It didn't take long for me to meet the neighbors. Mrs. Dunlap, an older woman who lived 2 doors down, was the first to introduce herself. She seemed friendly, if a little odd. She spoke in a slow, deliberate manner, as though carefully choosing her words. But it wasn't long before I noticed how uncomfortable people seemed when they spoke about the town's history. One evening, as we sat sipping tea on her porch, she mentioned the woods. "You know," she said, staring off into the distance, "people don't go into those woods after dark. Not unless they have to." I raised an eyebrow. "Why? Are there dangerous animals or something?" She hesitated before answering. "It's not the animals. It's something else. Something older." I couldn't hide my confusion. "What do you mean?" Her eyes flicked to the trees behind her house, and for a brief moment I saw something in her gaze. Fear, maybe, or regret. "There are things in those woods that you don't want to mess with. People around here used to know better than to go poking around in places they shouldn't." I tried to laugh it off. "Come on, it can't be that bad. I'm sure it's just some old local superstition." Mrs. Dunlap's lips pressed into a thin line. "I hope you're right," she said quietly. "Just be careful." I didn't think much of it at the time. I figured it was just another small-town rumor, the kind of thing people say when they've lived in one place for too long and want to add mystery to their lives. But the more I heard about the town, the stranger it seemed. The town's history was full of gaps, like pieces of a puzzle that had been deliberately hidden. The town records were vague, and when I tried to dig deeper into its past, the local librarian, a man named Mr. Carter, became visibly uncomfortable. "You're better off not knowing," he said one afternoon when I asked about Black Hollow's early settlers. "Some things are better left buried." That night, I decided to take a walk. The air was thick with humidity, and the cicadas' constant drone seemed to fill every corner of the town. I felt the weight of the atmosphere pressing down on me as I walked along the edge of the forest, the dense trees creating a dark wall that felt like it was closing in. As I walked further down the road, I stumbled upon an old stone wall. It was covered in ivy, almost hidden by the undergrowth, but it looked ancient. Curious, I walked closer and found that it surrounded a small clearing in the woods. The trees here were much older than those around the town, twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching toward each other like skeletal hands. In the center of the clearing stood a circle of stones, arranged in a perfect ring. The stones were uneven, some larger than others, and each one was covered in strange markings. I knelt down to get a closer look, but as soon as my fingers touched one of the stones, I felt a sharp jolt of electricity course through my body. I pulled my hand back, heart racing, but the feeling lingered. It was as if the stone itself was alive, humming with some dark energy. I stood up quickly, looking around, my breath coming faster. It was then that I heard it, the sound of footsteps approaching. At first I thought it was just an animal, but then the rustling grew louder, deliberate, and then I saw them. Figures emerged from the shadows, their movements slow and measured. They were cloaked in dark robes, their faces hidden by hoods. There were at least a dozen of them, maybe more, all standing in a wide circle around the stone ring. I couldn't make out their faces, but I could feel their eyes on me, cold and unblinking. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest, but they didn't move. The air grew colder, and I could feel the pressure of something ancient and malevolent pressing in around me. One of them stepped forward. The figure's hooded face was hidden, but I could hear their voice, low, guttural, almost a whisper. "You shouldn't have come." I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what was happening, but I could feel an overwhelming sense of dread suffocating me. The figures seemed to move closer, closing the circle around me. "Leave," the voice repeated, more forcefully now. "Now." I turned and ran. I didn't look back, just pushed myself through the dense trees, the branches whipping at my face as I ran faster and faster. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the woods, breathless and trembling. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I stepped outside, I felt eyes on me, following my every move. I heard whispers in the wind, voices that seemed to call my name, even though I was alone. And every time I tried to go back to the clearing, the stones, the circle, something stopped me. It was as though an invisible barrier had formed, preventing me from getting close. I asked around town about what I had seen, but everyone was tight-lipped. Mrs. Dunlap's warning came flooding back to me. The cult, the stones, the dark things in the woods. I began to understand that Black Hollow wasn't just a sleepy little town. It was a place where something ancient, something evil had taken root. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard the faintest scratching sound at the window. I tried to ignore it, but it grew louder, more insistent. I got up and pulled back the curtain, half expecting to see a tree branch brushing against the glass, but there was nothing there. Just the empty night. The woods stretching out beyond the window like an endless abyss. That's when I saw it. A figure, standing just beyond the tree line. It was cloaked in dark robes, the same as the ones I had seen in the clearing. And then another appeared, and another, until there were dozens of them, standing still, like shadows watching my house. I backed away from the window, my heart racing, and that's when I heard the whispering again, louder this time, filling the room with words I couldn't understand. The next morning, I packed my things. I didn't know where I would go, but I couldn't stay in Black Hollow any longer. The town had a secret, something dark that had been hiding for generations, and I had been foolish enough to stumble right into it. As I drove away from the town, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The whispers followed me, lingering in my ears, and I knew with a certainty that I had been marked. Whatever had been waiting in the woods had seen me, and now it wouldn't let me go. The further I drove, the lighter the air seemed to become. But deep down, I knew that Black Hollow would always be with me, lurking in the shadows, waiting. Story, the end.
Story number 11.
I moved to a small town called Hollow Creek, trying to escape a life that had become too suffocating. It was the kind of place where everyone knew your name, where the streets were lined with oak trees, and where the quiet hum of life felt comforting at first. But there was something about Hollow Creek that was off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. It felt too perfect, almost like it was a place people tried too hard to make inviting, as if they were trying to hide something. I rented a small cottage on the edge of town, of a place that had been empty for years. The landlord, a strange woman named Mrs. Caldwell, was as secretive as the town itself. She had insisted that I sign the lease without asking too many questions, and when I did, she handed me the keys with a tight smile. "Just remember," she had said, "some things in this town are better left alone." I brushed it off as an eccentric old woman's warning and settled in. The first few weeks were uneventful. I spent my days exploring the town, walking the narrow streets, and stopping in the local diner where the same people sat every morning. But as the days passed, I started to notice things. Small things at first. The occasional shadow darting past my window at night, a whisper I couldn't quite hear, the feeling of being watched even when no one was around. The house itself seemed to have a life of its own. The floorboards creaked at odd hours, and sometimes I could swear I heard footsteps in the attic, though I had checked it myself and found nothing. One night, as I sat in the small living room reading a book, I felt it again, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I glanced up and saw a figure standing outside my window. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It was a man, cloaked in black, his face hidden by a dark hood. He stood motionless, staring into the house. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. I hurried to the door to check if he was still there, but when I opened it, no one was outside. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I closed the door and locked it, but the unsettling feeling lingered. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the house made me jump. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps. I kept the light on in the living room until the early hours of the morning, but the sense of dread didn't leave me. The next day, I decided to take a walk to clear my mind. As I passed through the town square, I saw a group of people gathered around an old, dilapidated building I hadn't noticed before. It was a large, Gothic church, its once grand steeple now broken and crumbling. The people gathered outside weren't speaking, but they were all wearing the same dark robes, their heads bowed as if in prayer. I felt an uneasy shiver run down my spine as I watched them. They didn't seem like regular townsfolk. There was something unnatural about their stillness. As I walked closer, one of them, a man with graying hair, looked up and met my gaze. His eyes were cold, empty, and for a moment I felt like he was staring right through me. I quickly looked away and hurried past, my heart racing. I felt like I had just crossed a line, like I had seen something I wasn't supposed to. The next few days were filled with strange occurrences. I began to hear the whispers more frequently, always in the background, just out of reach. One night I woke to the sound of chanting. It was faint at first, like it was coming from far away. But as I listened, it grew louder. The words were unintelligible, but the rhythm of the chant sent a chill through me. I tried to ignore it, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized it was coming from the direction of the old church. That's when I made the decision to investigate. I knew I shouldn't, but my curiosity was stronger than my fear. I waited until nightfall, when the streets were empty and the town was silent. I grabbed a flashlight, bundled up in a coat, and walked toward the church. The fog had rolled in again, thick and heavy, making it almost impossible to see more than a few feet ahead of me. The chanting continued in the distance, growing louder with each step I took. When I reached the church, I was startled to find the door slightly ajar. I pushed it open, and a wave of cold air hit me. The inside of the church was pitch black, except for the faint glow of candles flickering in the corners. I stepped inside cautiously, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. The chanting was clearer now, reverberating off the stone walls. I followed the sound down a narrow hallway and into a large room at the back of the church. There, standing in a circle around an altar, were the same people I had seen earlier in the town square. Their hoods were up and their faces were obscured, but I could feel their eyes on me. The man with graying hair stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and gravelly. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. The room seemed to close in around me, the air thick with a sense of foreboding. My heart raced as I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me. The chanting grew louder, more insistent. I turned to see the others slowly walking toward me, their robes flowing like shadows. "Why are you doing this?" I finally managed to ask, my voice shaking with fear. The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "We have been here longer than you can imagine. Hollow Creek is our home, and it has always been ours. We are the Black Circle, the keepers of the town's darkest secret." "What do you want from me?" I demanded, trying to back away, but my legs felt heavy, like I was sinking into the floor. "You are the key," he said, his smile widening. "You always have been." Before I could respond, the other members of the cult began to chant again, their voices rising in a strange, hypnotic rhythm. The air seemed to vibrate with the energy of their words. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, and when I turned, I saw a woman standing next to me, her eyes empty, her face pale. "You're one of us now," she whispered. "You can never leave." Panic surged through me. I spun around, trying to escape, but the door wouldn't budge. My heart raced as I backed into the altar, desperate for a way out. I could feel the walls closing in on me, the air thick with the oppressive weight of their power. I screamed, but no sound escaped my lips. The last thing I remember was the cold, clammy hands grabbing me, pulling me toward the altar. The chanting drowned out all other noise, and then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything went silent. I woke up hours later, lying in the middle of the church floor, disoriented and terrified. The candles were extinguished, and the room was empty. The door was wide open, and the fog had cleared. I stumbled to my feet, shaken, my mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. I never spoke to anyone about what I had seen that night. After that, I left Hollow Creek. I couldn't stay, not with the memories of the black circle still haunting me. But every now and then, I hear their whispers, faint but persistent, always just out of reach. And sometimes when I'm alone at night, I can almost hear the chanting calling me back. Story the end.
Story number 12.
I had always been a skeptic. I dismissed tales of ghosts and cults as nonsense, convinced that people who claimed to have had paranormal experiences were simply products of their imagination or mental instability. That belief was shattered the moment I moved to the small town of Willow Creek. It wasn't a place I had ever heard of before, and in retrospect, I wish I had kept it that way. I was just looking for a quiet place to escape the hustle and bustle of city life, and Willow Creek seemed like the perfect refuge. It was a town with only a few thousand residents, surrounded by dense woods and rolling hills. The air was fresh, the pace of life slow, and the neighbors were polite but distant. I rented a small cottage on the outskirts of town, a place that was tucked just on the edge of the forest. The house was old but charming, with a thick layer of ivy crawling up the stone walls and a small garden out front. I spent the first few days getting acquainted with the area, walking through the town, visiting the local shops, and getting a feel for the quiet rhythm of life there. But something about the woods unnerved me. Every time I ventured too close, I would feel a strange weight in the air, as though the forest itself were watching me. It wasn't just the eerie stillness that clung to the trees. It was something deeper, something ancient and unsettling. Yet despite this, I couldn't resist the pull to explore. I assumed it was all in my head, a product of my overactive imagination. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip low in the sky, I decided to take a walk in the woods. I had heard from a few of the townspeople that there were some beautiful trails through the forest, so I thought I would explore. I grabbed a jacket and headed out toward the trees, hoping the exercise would clear my mind. At first, the walk was peaceful. The sound of leaves rustling in the wind and birds calling to each other calmed me, and I soon found myself lost in the serenity of the woods. But as I ventured deeper, I noticed something strange, a sense of silence, a heavy, almost oppressive quiet. The birds stopped singing, and the wind seemed to die down. I paused, feeling the change in the air. The trees around me were unnaturally still, and the light from the setting sun cast long shadows across the forest floor. Then I saw it. In the distance, partially obscured by a thicket of trees, was a small clearing. At the center of the clearing stood a circle of stones, old and weathered, their surfaces covered in strange symbols that I couldn't make out from where I stood. Something about it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't just the stones themselves, it was the way they seemed to pulse with a kind of energy, like they were alive. I knew I had to see it up close. I stepped forward, my steps tentative, as though my instincts were warning me to turn back. But curiosity won out, and I pushed through the underbrush toward the clearing. As I entered, I could feel the temperature drop, a chill settling over me as the stones loomed closer. I knelt down to inspect them, brushing away the dirt and moss that clung to their surfaces. The symbols on the stones were unlike anything I had ever seen. Some of them resembling ancient runes, others twisted, jagged shapes that made no sense. Suddenly, I heard a rustling behind me. I spun around, my heart racing, but there was nothing there. Only the trees, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. But that was enough. Something wasn't right. I stood up, about to turn and leave, when I saw them. Figures emerging from the shadows of the trees. At first, I thought they were just other hikers, but the closer they got, the more I realized something was off. They were dressed in long, dark robes, their faces obscured by hoods. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel their presence, their eyes burning into me from beneath their hoods. One of them stepped forward, and I froze. Their voice was low and smooth, carrying an unsettling calm. "You shouldn't be here." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. The air had grown heavy again, thick with a pressure that made it difficult to breathe. "You've seen too much," the figure said, taking another step closer. Without thinking, I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound of footsteps followed me, but I dared not look back. I pushed through the trees, desperate to get out of the clearing, to escape whatever was happening. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had seen. What kind of cult was this? Why had they been watching me? When I finally broke free from the trees and emerged onto the road that led back to town, I didn't stop running until I reached my cottage. I slammed the door behind me, my breath ragged, my body trembling from the adrenaline. I locked the door and collapsed onto the floor, trying to process what had just happened. I didn't sleep that night. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I began to hear strange noises outside my window at night, soft whispers, faint footsteps in the distance. When I tried to tell the townspeople what had happened, they all seemed to know exactly what I was talking about, but none of them would say anything directly. It was as if they were afraid to speak of it, afraid of drawing attention to what was happening in those woods. Mrs. Dunlap, the elderly neighbor who had warned me about the forest, was the first to speak openly. She visited me one morning, her face pale and drawn, her hands shaking. I didn't want to say anything, she said quietly, her voice trembling. But you've seen it, haven't you? The cult? I nodded, too frightened to speak. They've been here for generations, she continued, her eyes darting nervously around the room. The town was built on a dark secret, and those woods, they've always been theirs. They gather there in the clearing, performing rituals, summoning things no one should ever mess with. I've heard the whispers, seen the shadows moving in the trees. I felt a chill run down my spine. Why doesn't anyone do anything? Why doesn't anyone stop them? Mrs. Dunlap's face grew darker. They're not just any cult. They're older than this town, older than the land itself. No one who's gone into those woods has ever come back the same, and some never come back at all. She paused as though weighing whether or not to continue. It's said that if you cross them, if you see too much, they'll take you, your soul. You'll become one of them. The words hung in the air between us, thick with terror. I didn't know what to think. How could I have stumbled into this? How could I have found myself in the middle of something so dark? The days that followed were filled with unease. The whispers grew louder, and every time I looked out my window, I felt as though the figures were still out there, watching. I could no longer tell what was real and what was imagined. Was I being followed? Were the shadows just figments of my mind, or was something truly after me? On the fourth night after the incident, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to leave. I packed my bags in a frantic rush, not even bothering to check if I had everything. I wasn't staying another night in Willow Creek, but as I reached for the door, I heard it, the soft scraping sound of a hooded figure outside my window. I turned, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure was standing in the yard, staring at me with glowing eyes from beneath its hood. It didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, watching me. And then I heard it, a voice, low and soft, drifting in on the wind. You can't leave. I slammed the door shut, locking it, but I knew it was no use. Whatever they were, whatever they wanted, they weren't going to let me go. The next morning, I left Willow Creek behind. I didn't look back. I don't know what happened to the town, but I do know this. I will never, ever return to those woods. Story the end.
Story number 13.
I had been living in the small town of Arlingwood for almost 6 months before I began to notice the strange occurrences. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Shadows that lingered a bit too long, whispers that I could never quite place. But as the days went on, I began to realize something more sinister was at work. And it all started the night I met the Millers. The Millers had recently moved into the house down the road from mine. The house itself was a large old Victorian, sitting on a stretch of land surrounded by dense woods. It had been empty for as long as I could remember. When I first saw them, I thought they were a normal family, a mother, a father, and 2 kids. They were kind enough, but there was something off about them. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but the way they kept to themselves, the way they would always disappear into the woods, set off a strange feeling in my gut. It was a Saturday evening when I decided to drop by their house and introduce myself. The air had that heavy feeling of impending rain, and the sky was a muted gray. As I knocked on their door, it swung open almost immediately. Mrs. Miller stood in the doorway, her expression polite but distant. She was slender, with long, dark hair, and her pale skin almost seemed to glow in the dim light of the house. "Hello, I'm Clara. I live just down the road," I said, smiling. "I thought I'd come by and say welcome to the neighborhood." "Oh, how kind of you." Mrs. Miller replied, her smile tight, almost forced. Please, come in. We don't get many visitors here. I stepped into the house and immediately I felt a chill. The interior was dimly lit, the walls adorned with strange symbols I couldn't quite recognize. The air smelled faintly of incense, and there was an unsettling stillness to the place, like the house hadn't truly come to life. We made our way into the living room, where her husband, Thomas, was sitting in an armchair reading a book. He looked up when I entered, his gaze sharp and calculating. "Nice to meet you," he said with a nod, his voice low and uninviting. I sat down, trying to make myself comfortable, but the longer I was there, the more I felt like I didn't belong. I glanced around, noticing the odd collection of religious icons and strange occult-like artifacts that lined the bookshelves. There was a large painting on the wall, a dark landscape with a shadowy figure standing alone in the woods. The longer I looked at it, the more it seemed to shift, as though the figure was watching me. "Do you like the painting?" Mrs. Miller asked, breaking my gaze. "It was done by an old friend of ours. He was very talented. He used to come to our gatherings." "Gatherings?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Yes, just small spiritual gatherings," she replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We do some meditation, some rituals. It helps us connect." I nodded, though a sense of unease crept up my spine. There was something more to her words, something hidden behind that polite smile. "I'm sure you've heard of the old church in the woods," Mr. Miller added suddenly, his voice carrying a weight to it. "It's been there for centuries. The town used to hold services there, but now it's mostly abandoned. Yet a lot of people avoid it, but we've always found it comforting." I glanced at them both, my mind racing. I had heard stories about the church. There were whispers about strange happenings in those woods, about people who had gone missing and never returned. I'd always chalked it up to local folklore, but now, hearing the Millers mention it in such a casual manner, I couldn't help but wonder if there was more to it. "I didn't realize the church was still used," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Oh, yes," Mrs. Miller said, her eyes gleaming with something I couldn't quite place. "We visit it often, especially on the full moon. There are rituals that need to be done." I froze. Rituals? My mind spun, trying to process what she was saying. Was this some kind of cult? Were they involved in something dangerous? I stood up abruptly, feeling like I was suffocating. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to intrude. I should go," I stammered, my heart pounding in my chest. Thomas didn't say anything, but his eyes followed me as I quickly made my way to the door. Mrs. Miller stood silently by the entrance, her smile still in place, but there was something about her eyes, something cold and calculating, that sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside, set my nerves on edge. I kept thinking about what Mrs. Miller had said about the church in the woods and the rituals. I didn't know what they were involved in, but I was certain it wasn't something good. The next day, I decided to do some research. I went into town, hoping to find something that would explain the strange behavior of the Millers. I stopped by the library and asked the librarian, an older woman named Mrs. Jacobs, if she knew anything about the church in the woods. She looked at me with narrowed eyes, then lowered her voice to a whisper. "You'd be better off leaving that church alone, child," she said. "People have disappeared from those woods. Strange things happen there. Some say it's cursed. The Millers? Well, they've been here for years, but they're not like the rest of us. Be careful what you get involved in." I left the library feeling a sense of dread settle over me. The more I learned, the more it seemed like the Millers were involved in something far darker than I could comprehend. But I couldn't just sit back and do nothing. I had to know the truth. That night, I decided to follow them. I waited until after dark, when the town was quiet and the fog had settled over the woods. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way down the road toward the Miller's house. I didn't know what I was expecting, but I had to see it for myself. I wasn't prepared for what I found. As I approached the woods, I saw the Millers standing at the edge, their backs to me. They were joined by several other people, all of them dressed in dark robes, their heads bowed in unison. In front of them was a stone altar, lit by the flickering light of dozens of candles. The air was thick with incense, and I could hear the faint hum of a chant, low and rhythmic, as they raised their hands toward the sky. I froze. my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the scene unfolding before me. There was something hypnotic about it, something that made it hard to breathe. And then, as if sensing my presence, one of the figures turned around. It was Mrs. Miller. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, as she stared straight at me. "Leave," she whispered, her voice carrying through the still night air. "This is not for you." I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. I turned and ran, not daring to look back, not stopping until I was safely inside my house. I bolted the door and collapsed onto the floor, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The Millers never spoke to me again. In fact, after that night, I rarely saw them at all. It was as if they had disappeared completely. But I knew better. They were still out there, in the woods, performing their rituals under the cover of darkness. I couldn't explain what had happened, but I knew one thing for sure. I had narrowly escaped something much darker than I had ever imagined. And to this day, I still hear the whispers in the wind, as if the Millers, the cult, are calling me back. Story the end.
Story number 14.
When I moved to Millstone, I was hoping for a fresh start. The small town nestled in the hills of the Appalachian Mountains seemed like the perfect escape. The air was fresh, the scenery breathtaking, and the people, at least at first, welcoming. I found a small house on the outskirts of town, a place with history, but no history of its own. At least that's what I thought. It was late autumn when I arrived, just before Halloween. The town was buzzing with preparations for their annual harvest festival, which I had heard was the event of the year. People decorated their homes with pumpkins and hay bales, and children were already planning their costumes. I spent my first few days unpacking and getting to know the area. Most of the town's residents were kind enough, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Everyone was friendly, but they didn't really know me. One afternoon, while walking to the post office, I saw a group of people standing in front of a large old church at the edge of town. The church was surrounded by a thick, twisted iron fence, its Gothic spires towering above the surrounding buildings. The windows were dark and cracked, and the once pristine white paint had long since peeled away, revealing the aged wood beneath. The group outside the church caught my attention because of their odd attire, black robes and long, flowing hoods. They didn't look like any churchgoers I'd ever seen, nor did they seem to belong to any religion I knew. There were no crosses, no symbols of faith, just an eerie quietness to their gathering. The air around them felt thick, unnatural. I tried not to stare, but couldn't help it. One of the figures noticed me watching and gave me a small, almost polite nod. His eyes were hidden in shadow, but I felt their weight all the same. I quickly turned away and hurried to the post office. After that encounter, I couldn't get the image of those people out of my mind. I decided to ask around about the church, figuring it was some old town relic that had fallen into disuse. Maybe it had been abandoned years ago, and the group was just part of some strange local tradition. I asked a few locals, but they always gave me vague answers, changing the subject before I could press further. Finally, I spoke with Mrs. Whitaker, the elderly woman who ran the small diner in town. She was friendly, but there was an unmistakable tension in her voice when I asked about the church. "That place, well, you best stay away from it, child," she said, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "It's not a place for outsiders. Folks around here, they don't talk about it much, but trust me, you don't want to get involved." Her warning only deepened my curiosity, but I decided to let it go for the time being. That was until a few nights later, when I saw something that would change everything. It was Halloween night, and I had decided to walk around town, taking in the decorations and festivities. The streets were full of families trick-or-treating, children running in costumes, and adults chatting in their front yards. As I passed by the old church, I noticed the group in robes standing in front of the gates once again. But this time, they weren't alone. There were more people, perhaps 20 or so, all standing in a large circle. A chill ran down my spine. It was strange how they didn't seem to notice the bustling festival around them, as if they were in a world of their own. The night air felt cold, almost suffocating, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Then something happened that made my heart race in my chest. The people in the circle began chanting. It wasn't loud, but the sound was unmistakable. Low and rhythmic, their voices synchronized in a language I couldn't understand. The air itself seemed to thrum with energy, vibrating in response to their words. I felt a sudden urge to move away, but my feet refused to obey. I couldn't look away, even though every instinct in my body screamed at me to run. Then I saw something, or someone emerge from the church. It was a figure in a black hooded robe, but it wasn't one of the people from the circle. This figure moved with a deliberate, almost predatory grace, walking between the robed figures. The others parted to let it through, their heads lowered as if in reverence. I could feel its presence from where I stood, and it felt wrong. It felt like something not of this world. I quickly turned and walked away, my heart pounding in my chest. As I moved further from the church, I dared to glance back. The figure was now at the center of the circle, raising its arms as the chanting grew louder. The world felt like it had narrowed into that single point of darkness. When I got home, I locked all the doors and windows. I couldn't stop shaking. I kept thinking about what I had seen, what it meant. That night, I didn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside seemed to send my heart into overdrive. I knew I had witnessed something that wasn't meant to be seen, something that was far beyond my understanding. The next day, I tried to act like everything was normal. I went to the diner and ordered my coffee, but Mrs. Whitaker seemed unusually quiet when I sat down. She avoided eye contact, and when I asked her again about the church, she responded with a clipped, "Don't go there." The unease settled into me, but it wasn't until a few days later that I learned the true extent of the terror the church held. I ran into a man named Greg at the local grocery store. He had a look in his eyes, tired, haunted, that made me instinctively step back when he started talking to me. He said he had been living in Millstone his entire life and had seen things no one should ever see. "You saw them, didn't you?" Greg asked me, his voice low and urgent. "The ones in the robes, the ones by the church." I nodded, my throat dry. "What is it? What are they doing?" He looked around, making sure no one was listening before he spoke again. "They're a cult," he whispered, his eyes darting nervously. "They've been here for generations, hidden in plain sight. They worship something that shouldn't exist in this world. They call it the Watcher. It lives in the woods, but it's not just in the woods. It's everywhere." Greg told me of his own experience with the cult. He had grown up in Millstone, but as a child, he had witnessed strange things happening around the church. People would disappear without a trace, and then reappear days or weeks later, hollow-eyed and silent. Some came back, their minds shattered, others never returned. "I tried to leave once," Greg said, his voice breaking. "I couldn't. The Watcher doesn't let you leave." I could barely breathe as he continued, describing the rituals and sacrifices the cult performed to summon the Watcher, an ancient entity that supposedly resided in the woods. He said the cult believed the Watcher granted them power, immortality, perhaps, but the price was always steep. They had to give something up, something vital to their humanity. I couldn't stay in Millstone after that. I packed my things and left the next day. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me ever since that night by the church. The eyes of those robed figures, the presence of the Watcher, were never far from my thoughts. I've never gone back to Millstone, and though I've moved on with my life, I still sometimes hear whispers on the wind when I'm alone in the dark. I wonder if they're calling me back, or if the Watcher is simply waiting for the right moment to claim what's left of me. Story, the end.